Good morning, everybody. The most common phrase of 2020, I believe, is, oops, I'm sorry, I was muted. My name is Brett Smith. I'm the Director of Technology at the Center for Automotive Research. Welcome to the Industry X People webinar. This is the first of a series of 3 webinars on Industry X. We have 3 speakers today. I will open with a few opening remarks and then turn it over to the speakers. There'll be an opportunity for questions, and those questions should be submitted to the questions section of your comments or your web interface. Center for Automotive Research has been exploring Industry X and technology for a long time, but over the last 8 months, we've been working on a project specifically. And as we started, it was an Industry 4.0 project. But we quickly learned, and working with some of our partners, that there is not a discrete point in this process. It is truly an evolutionary process. Industry X recognizes that the pace of change has become so rapid that it no longer makes sense to think of manufacturing and production in advancing in discrete stages. Industry X kind of covers this ability. It's an evolution. I mentioned partners. Over the last 8 months, we've been working with this group of companies, Intel, Dell, Cloudera, Rockwell, PTC, Accenture, and Microsoft Azure on this Industry X project. Greatly appreciated their support and their participation. And together, they developed for us a really important ecosystem for Industry X. I'll always say not the only ecosystem, but a very good ecosystem of knowledge. And we've been able, through the project, and today even especially with Dr. Petrick from Intel, to leverage that knowledge to shape our webinars, shape our research, and help inform you. Our Industry X project is part of a continuum. It is not the whole process. The more we got into this, we realized a lot of things. But one is, data is flowing faster, farther, and in greater quantities in all manufacturing and production systems, but specifically the automotive. If you just think about where data is flowing to and from now, the design, the product engineering, the supply chain, the manufacturing part of it, the in-use vehicle, the in-vehicle use part, the in-life, all of this data is just flowing in such mass quantities, it becomes really challenging and really great opportunities. Ours focused on the manufacturing side. Obviously, there's, as we went through this project and this work, it connects up and down the side, right to left on the scale, but it really focused there. The Industry X roles and boundaries, as we've defined, and these are I think, a good start at it, but today's discussion will have more depth to this. There's the production workers. There's the operations technology. There's the IT information technology, the information technologies folks. And there's this leadership, and that's C-suite and slightly below, but all of those are greatly challenged by Industry X and a great opportunity. We had a round table a couple of days ago, and I thought a really fascinating description of how this is changing. Several of the companies in the round table said, look, we expect our IT people to have grease under their fingernails. The IT team is now in the shop, getting in the floor and understanding it. If they don't do that, they're not going to be able to help implement this in an effective way. Industry X is also often thought of as a technology, but it's not. It's much more than a technology. We broke it down into the pillars of technology, strategy, process, and people. All of those are good pillars. They are part of this process. But the more we realized, the more we did this, the more we realized this is amazingly integrated. You can't have the technology right if you don't have the strategy, the process, and the people, and all of the above. And more so, and maybe this comes from having spent 15 years doing labor education in manufacturing facilities. Very importantly, I put people at the middle of these triangles, because without those people, whether it be the leaders, whether it be the OT, the IT, or the production people, without them on board, without them knowledgeable, and without them knowing what's happening and what could happen going forward, it's a really tough thing to implement. With that, I would like to get started with the panelists. We have three really fascinating, really great panelists today. It's not your traditional CAR group of panelists. We have three scientists. That's fun. That's really cool. Three people that are very much world-renowned in this space, but not necessarily automotive folks. And often for a car, it's important, well, we need to get an automotive person in there. Well, we have three automotive people, but they're scientists. And it's kind of a fun or different way to start. So our first is Dr. Sue Helper. And Sue, I've known Sue for 30-some years. Sue is, as I said this a couple of days ago, one of the absolute legends in production employee labor and training. Dr. Irene Petrick is the Senior Director of Industrial Innovation at Intel. And like Sue, she has spent an enormous amount of time looking at what Industry X or Industry 4.0 means to the workforce. And Liz Reynolds is the Principal Research Scientist, Executive Director of MIT Work of the Future program. And she, like Sue, has been deep into this for a long time. The three of them give a great perspective on what is happening with the workforce. Our format today, Sue and Liz will start off with a joint presentation, and then once they're done, Irene will give a presentation. After that, we'll have a Q&A. I greatly encourage two things. I greatly encourage the participants to send in questions. And I also encourage Liz, Sue, and Irene to question each other and us on this. So with that, I think, Liz, you're going to lead off for Sue and yourself. So I'll turn this over to you, Liz. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Brett. It's a pleasure to be here. And I want to say that we've been really fortunate to have a great partnership with CAR over the years and over the course of this particular project at MIT called the Work of the Future. And if you will all give me a little bit of liberty here, I'm going to actually start and provide a broader picture as to why MIT launched this effort called Work of the Future, and provide a little bit of context, and then let Sue will step in and into the specific research that we've done with respect to manufacturing and technology. So let me begin first by saying, and let's switch, if we could go to the next slide, please. There we go. That a couple of years ago, MIT launched the Work of the Future initiative. It's a institute-wide initiative across 5 schools involving 20+ faculty from diverse disciplines. We've got the roboticists and the economists, the computer scientists, and the anthropologists, looking at the relationship between new emerging technologies, AI, robotics, etc., and the nature of work and how these are evolving and changing. And a lot of this was motivated, if you can remember, and I think it was sort of pre-COVID, we have to put all of this in the context of pre-COVID, but a real concern, are the robots coming to take everyone's job? And that was a lot of the anxiety and concern, I think, that we were hearing in the public and in our Super Bowl advertisements, etc. And what the task force has come to determine, and we'll be actually announcing this next week at or launching our final report and holding a Congress next Wednesday, the 18th, for anyone who's interested in joining, is that in fact our concern going forward is not about the elimination of work. Our issue is not going to be, will there be enough jobs? Our issue will really be about the quality of those jobs. Technology absolutely is both, replacing existing work and creating new work all the time. And the question is really how the distribution of the tasks is played out. How is technology both substituting and complementing tasks? And that's something that I think that our work is going to try and illuminate in this conversation and beyond. So I'm going to start with a little bit of, while we understand that technology, work will exist, that's not our issue. We also understand, as Brett had said, that technology is sort of evolutionary, not revolutionary, in a lot of the changes going on right now. While the pace is really quick, the long-term scale of change, we're really in the first inning of autonomous vehicles, for example. A lot of the things that are really important today in IT are things that were invented 40 years ago. And so we're really in a long cycle. And so our issue is trying to understand how do we create quality jobs and help workers through this transition, and not be so concerned about whether there will be jobs at the end of the day, but really about the quality of those jobs. So let me just take a few minutes to just provide some context before we dive into the details of the seminar. And so the next slide, please, is going to show why we're kind of concerned. Why do people have any concern about the future of work or about the robots coming? And I think this slide helps provide that context, which is, if we look at the top line, that top blue line, that has been basically the productivity growth in the US since the 1940s through recently. And it's followed by average compensation for workers. That includes all workers, four-year college degree and others. And then the bottom two lines are those that represent kind of the average worker compensation, or the typical worker, so non-supervisory roles. And what we see is those lines kind of track together for a good 40 years, right until the early 70s, where productivity growth and compensation were growing at about the same pace, and kind of showed kind of an alignment between those two. What happened in the 70s was this divergence. And when we start to take out the four-year college degree holder from our equation about worker compensation, what we see is that the typical worker did not share in a lot of the benefits that have been accrued through productivity growth over the last 40 years. And here we understand is a lot of the concern and distrust, really, of technology and of innovation for the majority of workers in this country, who 40% of which have a high school degree or below. This has been their reality, and this is what we think has generated this concern about technology and about innovation going forward, and what it means for the typical worker. Next slide, please. What we often get is people asking, well, is this time different? Is this a completely new experience in the U.S.? Well, we have a historian who's leading this effort, and he says, every time is different. You can't compare. But we do think there are two factors that are playing a role here. One is employment polarization. So technology has played a role, as has trade and other factors, to a hollowing out of our middle. So a lot of our production work and clerical work over the decades has been eliminated largely from our automation, and we've had growth at the low end of a lot of our service-oriented jobs, whether it's healthcare, retail, et cetera, and growth at the high end, our professionals, our managers, our data scientists, et cetera. And so this employment polarization is really different than what we've seen in the past, and one of the challenges, I think, for the country right now. The second idea, which is, I think, a novel and kind of an interesting question for people to ask themselves, is socio-technologies. This is a concept that was developed by the economist at MIT, Daron Acemoglu, and his colleague Pasquale Restrepo at BU. But basically, that a lot of times in history, we've seen a lot of new technologies that basically lift everybody up. The productivity, whether you're on the factory floor, whether you're in the management office, everybody has a boost up. And that's, if you think about electricity, for example, that had that kind of impact. There's this concept right now about socio-technologies, technologies that, yes, and on the margin, they're going to reduce your labor costs. They're going to get rid of a few workers. We think of the self-checkout kiosk, but have they really driven significant productivity? Are they really innovative enough to sort of drive productivity such that we see, workers really, we're getting more out of our worker productivity? And we haven't necessarily seen that. And so that's one of the explanations for why productivity growth might be a little bit slower than we expect. We look around, we see all this technology. Why aren't we seeing it in our productivity growth numbers? Well, one is that people are investing in these kind of socio-technologies. The other, of course, is that it takes a long time. And for everybody in this business, you will say it takes much longer than people expect or that they predict. For example, what people have thought about autonomous vehicles, for example. So that's another reason why we think this time is a little bit different in terms of how technology is affecting jobs. Next slide, please. The other point just to make and to set the stage, of course, COVID has been a dramatic impact, economic collapse for many industries in this country, and a significant employment loss for a lot of people. Interestingly, manufacturing seems to have weathered things relatively well. at least based on some of the surveys that have been taken. But the fact is that the one thing we do know about the future is our demographics. There is little uncertainty about what's happening with our aging workforce, with our fertility rates, some uncertainty about our immigration policies. Nevertheless, what we see is basically we're having an aging workforce, and for all of these reasons, we are going to be long-term short workers. And I think for those who pre-COVID, a lot of people would agree, we have had challenges finding workers for certainly at the wages we're having and the skill sets we see right now, finding workers for a lot of the jobs that are out there. So this is an area that long-term, I think, is something we have to pay attention to and think about in terms of what the role of automation and the role of training going forward. And then my final slide here, or not my final slide, but the next slide that I want to speak to is this, what we're learning about the science of learning and what that speaks to in terms of training and our workforce. So if anybody watching this is over the age of 20, you might follow these blue and green lines all the way down, this like steady slope downward, which is essentially what happens to your, quote, fluid skills, your speed of processing, working memory, all of that over your lifetime. But there is hope. There's hope for those of us over 50 on those red lines. What we call crystallized knowledge or domain knowledge actually increases over time into your 70s, even into your 80s. And that is, I think, something that we've heard in talking to a lot of the firms we've been interviewing, is that basically what their ideal workforce is taking the domain knowledge of the older workers and marrying it with the tech savviness of the younger generation. And how can we have both of those working cohorts working together, complementing each other, and bringing the best out of both of those cohorts. And so hopefully that's a part of the conversation going forward. Let me just close with another slide that speaks to what we're doing in the work of the future here at MIT that speaks to manufacturing. There's the work that Suzanne Berger and Julie Shaw have been doing on looking at how we're adopting robots in the US and in Germany. Obviously, very different rates of adoption in those two countries. There's research Sue is going to be talking about talking to, particularly in mobility, about what we've been learning about new technologies and workers. We have two research briefs coming out next week specifically on collaborative robotics and on additive manufacturing. And then we also published a brief just a few months ago on autonomous vehicles, mobility and employment policy by John Leonard, David Mindell, and Eric Staten, who are looking at exactly what we see in terms of AV technology and the fact that there's a real evolution ahead of us there, and also a lot of regional variation as to how regions are going to introduce this technology. Finally, we have, just to give everybody, for those who are in the Detroit, Michigan area, our next slide shows exactly what we're doing in that with a project out in Detroit. This has been funded by the Wilson Foundation, but looking at the various different dimensions of mobility and what we know how technology is touching upon this, whether it's in innovative new technologies, urban mobility, skills and training, and then what we see happening in firms and industries. That work will be coming out the first quarter of 2021. So we look forward to informing you more about that. All right, at that point, I think I'm going to hand off to Sue.
Great. Next slide, please. So I want to do a couple things in just a few minutes. So one is talk a little bit about a survey I did in the US and Italy of automotive suppliers adopting both automation and also data analytics. Second, I want to talk a little bit about an aspect of people that I think may be underrated. The people is not just people as individuals and their individual skills, but also how they relate to each other. And digital transformation can also mean a transformation in that as well. So to talk first about the survey, we did a survey, and many of the people on this webinar filled it out. I'm very grateful. And we also got some data from Italy as well, and had partnership with Center for Automotive Research, which was very wonderful. Next slide. So a key thing, Liz mentioned at the beginning about different views on whether technology complements workers or substitutes for workers. I think an older view that we still see and still has some relevance is that technology can and data analytics can replace workers. We don't need people using rules of thumb and kind of guesses when they replace equipment or try to do some maintenance or something. We can have precise algorithms. Another view is that actually workers and automation and data analytics can all work happily together. And I'll give some examples of that later. But one thing I think is interesting about this view is that we actually see quite a distribution of views on this. Most of the respondents, which were auto suppliers in the US, thought that there was a fair amount of complementarity between workers and technology. That's the left side. But you also see there's people who are neutral or who disagree. Next slide. There's widespread adoption of a lot of the hardware that's involved here. And this slide includes data from both the US and Italy, the US in gray and Italy in green. You can see that 90% of the firms in the US have some kind of sensors on their equipment. They have automated parts tracking for 2/3 of their parts. Oh, whoops. We go back. Sorry. 80% have machine vision, 80% have robots. At this time, when we did the survey a year or so ago, cobots were not so prevalent, but they're coming into their own. Okay, now next slide. And these automated equipment, produce a lot of data. You don't have to, count the parts. The robot will count the parts for you. But in terms of firms figuring out what to do with this, they're a lot less far along than they are in adopting. And so we see that 30% of the firms in the US think they typically implement the data manually. That 60% say data gathering is a mix of manual and automated processes. And whoops, we go back. And then the kind of vision of Industry 4.0, let alone Industry X, of the far right, where sensors on machines send data to a unified corporate business system that integrates data from operations, HR, finance, and sales. That's about 9% of firms. So this is something that is surprisingly hard, and but yet yields some payoffs. Next slide. So to talk specifically then about the people side of what, why is this so hard? And as I mentioned, training is key, but you also want to think about how these people interact. And digital transformation benefits also from organizational transformation. And so just to make 3 quick points, and we could come back to this. I talked already about some firms see workers as complements to digitization and others as substitutes. And I'll give an example in a second. There's a potential for overcoming silos between firms. And then finally, I will get to some implications for training. So next slide. And so I gave an example already of a firm that we heard from that had some fans, cooling fans, that sometimes would fail. And if the fans fail, then the process, all the equipment melts, and it's really terrible. In the past, workers is judged when that was right. They've now been able to do this with an algorithm that allows them in practice to run the fans longer without risking this meltdown. In other cases, we've seen digitization as a complement to workers' judgment, and the idea here is that production, if you're close to production, you can generate hypotheses that can help improve data collection and can help you interpret data already collected. That one of the issues we've heard is that you now can be in a world of too much data. A big factory can generate a terabyte of data per hour, many correlations are going to be significant, but which ones are meaningful? So just to talk about two stampers and how they deal with sensor data, one of them, really wanted to know every time a press went down, and so locked the sensors. The sensors stop production if they find a fault, lock them, the worker has to find a supervisor. Another one, a very similar production process, has put an immense amount of money into training, and including training for the worker on which problems they should solve themselves and when they should get a supervisor. And so they, as a result, have seen their uptime go up a lot, both because problems are solved more quickly and also because the workers and the engineers are involved in some kind of continuous joint problem-solving processes where they're not spending a lot of time, collecting data first. The data is already there. Next slide. So we're seeing a few examples, and this is hard to actually help use the data to overcome the silos in the organization. This requires a huge amount of effort on data standardization, that everything is measured in, you pick one, meters, centimeters, inches, whatever. But you can do things like figure out, oh wow, HR spent a whole bunch of money on training. Can we see that later in uptime? Purchasing went with a cheaper supplier that maybe benefited their metrics, but did it cause an increase in defects in operations? And so one of the things we've also heard about is the difficulty of encouraging experimentation. As an economist, I always looking for what the incentives are. And by incentives, I don't necessarily just mean money. It means, what will get you not yelled at? What will top management, use as a good thing to put on your performance evaluation? If you have a lot of tight requirements around production and quality, people are going to be very loath to do something that might jeopardize those metrics, even if in the long term it pays off. A second issue we hear a ton about skill shortages. Is other research I've done, you can see wage stagnation. I think Liz showed wage stagnation in the economy as a whole. That's true in manufacturing as well. To some extent, I think manufacturers may be guilty of, wanting to get a Lexus at a Tercel or Corolla price. In everything else, we expect to get what we pay for, and that can be true for workers as well. One of the things that you can do with this data is actually see if you do raise wages, what kinds of, that's an obvious cost, but there may also be some hidden benefits. Next slide. So one key area potentially is, as I mentioned, is democratizing data analytics. And as part of this Wilson project that Liz mentioned, we, particularly Allison Forbes on our team, have been doing a bunch of work with community colleges who are very eager to help and provide skills. And one area we thought potentially could be useful is democratizing data analytics. That if everybody, or at least the technicians on the floor, have the ability not just to run standard reports, but to suggest new reports, to look at correlations between variables, that could be incredibly valuable. And we're talking about, 1 or 2 courses. It'd be interesting to know if people think that this is actually something that could in fact be valuable, how it would be organized, etc. And next slide. And that's the last one. Look forward to your questions and comments.
Sue and Liz, thank you very much. And Liz, I want to go back, if you can bring yourself back up for a moment. You had mentioned an event or an activity next week, and I think you said if you're interested.
It's actually right there at the bottom, the very last line of the slide.
There it is. There it is.
Yeah, we would love to have people involved. In fact, we have one of the senior engineers from Ford speaking on their Factory of Tomorrow work, which might be of interest to people. And go ahead.
No, it's free of charge, and people can just go to this website and register if they're interested.
Well, it's not free of charge, Brett, but for this group, I'm prepared to make it free of charge. So I just need to put put that up on a website. Apparently my communications people would go crazy. So what I might do is pass that on to you, and people, we can you can put it out maybe in an email.
We will do that. Thank you very much. All of us appreciate that opportunity. I'm sure a couple of people from CAR will be joining.
Yes.
Thank you again, Liz and Sue. Our next speaker is Dr. Irene Petrick from Intel. And Irene, are you ready to go?
Yes, I think I am.
That transition always takes a moment.
Can you see my screen?
We can.
Wonderful. So thanks, Brett, for inviting me to join you. I'm going to spend the next probably 10 minutes or so briefly introducing a study that my colleague Faith McCrary and I have been doing. I'll start with the big picture of digital transformation that Susan and Liz talked about also, but then I'll jump right away into the changing nature of work and workers. I'll emphasize the skills gap that we see developing. I'll talk very briefly about some implications of COVID. And then if I have time, I'll talk about leading digital transformation and what it's going to take. So the study that my colleague Faith McCrary and I have been working on is the last 3 years. We've got over 150 hours of interviews, 7,000 data sets, over 500 participants, with over 400 companies. This is only in the industrial space, so it's not only automotive, it's both process and discrete manufacturing from across a broad variety of sectors. In 2018, we focused on looking at what was happening in the factory, inside the factory walls, from the factory floor to the C-suite, and we really asked what was happening with work, and because of the way work was evolving, were workers also expecting to evolve? In 2019, we focused on what tactics and strategies could actually accelerate smart activities, which are AI plus Internet of Things activities. And then more recently, not surprisingly, with an emphasis on the Manufacturing 100, we're actually doing a longitudinal study that actually focuses efforts on what's happening with COVID, what's a knee-jerk reaction that we're seeing right this minute, and what's going to continue on into 2021. And so we were just finishing the first set of data on that. A lot of these reports are available at my LinkedIn profile. You can get them. I'd be happy to correspond with any of you if you want some of the more in-depth material. So echoing what Liz was saying and Susan was saying, when we talked to our participants in this study, 73% of them said that this is digital transformation is a holistic problem. It's not just about the technology. It's the people, it's the process, it's the technology, and it's the organization and its culture. And you can see here on the right-hand side some of the top factors that the participants called out. Not surprisingly, operational technology and legacy systems are the top two. Maybe a surprise for some of you might be that people, 54% of the complexity is really the result of people, enterprise systems, business characteristics, etc. What this suggests is it's a systems of systems problem, and it requires a system of systems approach to actually address it. So let me turn to that 2018 work for a moment. We asked people from the factory floor to the boardroom, we asked, what does work look like in the future? And they told us 3 things that were really important to them. First of all, they expected that work became more automated. Not only did they expect it, many of the laborers actually welcomed it on the factory floor, believing that automation was going to get rid of some of the mundane, routine, or difficult tasks. And so they were actually less resistant than we expected. Most people said they expected work to become more strategic. They wanted to understand how their job impacted the bottom line, how their job added value, and because of that, they expected work was going to become more transparent between different stages in the production process. You can see this quote on the right from one of our participants, a worker on the manufacturing line, and what he's complaining about is there isn't clear communication and there really aren't clear instructions. And so one of the first skills gaps we see is an experience gap. As companies go down the digital transformation road, the experience of leaders and workers to actually understand what should happen next is lacking. It's getting better, but it's still not there. And so this creates three kinds of big challenges: information challenges, communications and coordination gaps. We have different people speaking from the OT and IT functions that don't normally speak and interact. And we have culture and organizational structure issues, the economies to scale production, functional silos that are very efficient, don't necessarily support some of this smart work very well. So we'll talk about the changing roles for a moment. We have, if you see on the left-hand side, this is from the people that we talked with. This isn't an Intel view. This isn't an Irene Petrick view necessarily. But what you can see here are the roles of today and the roles that the workers expect to see in the future. And the way to read this is you have a role and you have a tagline. And that tagline really is sort of a one sentence of what would this person be thinking. So for example, the hands-on risk spotter says quality matters here, do it right even when I'm not looking. What you can see though is that there's a very different profile on the left today as to what people expect there will be on the factory floor in the future. So the factory floor, you see that we have factory supervisors, risk spotters, and workers. Those three merge into one of two roles: the factory pit boss, who uses data to really drive his or her operations, and then that minimally manual laborer. And this is somebody that workers believe still needs to be on the factory floor. But interestingly, nobody wants to be that person that has to do this minimally manual labor. The other thing you should notice is that we have a DevOps steward. Today we have IT and OT, information technology and operating technology, in two very different silos. In the future, the prediction is that those two will be merged into a single department and eventually into an individual's head. From a factory influence or a leader's perspective, I won't spend too much time on this one, but the important piece is the proactive use of data. The transformative leader basically says, I put data at the heart of my organization to empower my employees. And that gets back to that theme I mentioned earlier of more strategic and more transparent. So when we ask technologists, and the technologists in the ecosystem that supports the factory, we said, what are the biggest things that are going to create problems for you to roll out smart technologies and smart projects? And what's going to actually constrain your ability to be successful? 36% said it's a technical skills gap. And I won't go through all of the others in this particular presentation. We've got a lot of data behind it. But I thought it was pretty surprising that 36% of the technologists see there's a technology skills gap. And the other thing I'll draw your attention to the quote, the important piece here is there is no finish line. I'm constantly having to update and I'm constantly having to upgrade, and so my work is never done. So we ask people in the future, or we ask people today, what are the skills that are most important to you? And these are the technologists once again. Today, basics of modern programming or software engineering was number one. Manufacturing prowess was number two. Communications, innovation, IT skills, data science, systems thinking, etc. And we didn't give these people a list ahead of time. We coded this after we got their responses. When we asked that same group, what's going to differentiate your company in the future? The first 5 skills for the future are all digital. Deep understanding of modern programming and software engineering, digital dexterity, data science, connectivity, cybersecurity. Manufacturing prowess doesn't even make it until number 6. So this, to us, points to a serious gap that we're going to be facing as manufacturers, and a serious gap that the education system is going to have to be thinking about, from everything from its engineers to its human resource capabilities. So we usually try and push people to say, ready, aim, fire. And it's really an idea of I have to have a sense of, am I ready to do what I think I should be doing? Have I got the right area that I'm going to do it? And then can I go and execute? What we believe is that that's actually short-sighted. It really needs to be aim, get ready, and then fire. And that aim really is the idea of setting up a vision at the beginning. 78% of the technologists we spoke with called out the importance of slowing down to go fast. And almost half of them said they learned this the hard way on projects. You need to think big to start small, which is that vision, and then incremental execution. And then you need to understand what metrics really matter. And you'll notice that 64% of the technologists themselves said operational outcomes and business value are crucial. So when we think about a skills gap, it's not just at the worker level, it's also at the manager level, being able to translate what these technologies can do from a business value perspective. So I'll turn very briefly to COVID. So the conversation that we've been having on factory floors has been all about efficiency and using robotics and to replace workers who are aging and retiring from the workforce with a lack of incoming workers at the younger levels. That conversation is changing completely to, am I healthy? Who around me is healthy? What are the risks in the environment? How can I work remotely? Who can work remotely? How do I become more localized so that I have more control over my supply chain? How quickly can I respond to changes? And this last one is really important. In doing more with less, how do we quickly decide what to do? In other words, how do I act with urgency and purpose? And so I'll just briefly talk about this, but I really want to emphasize that what we really are going to focus on, I'll speak to the greater emphasis on the human in the loop aspect of this. What we really think about is, as I have fewer workers on my factory floor, many of whom are the mission critical workers, they become much more important in my chain of production. And I'm going to have greater emphasis on them and their needs. And that's a difference that we haven't seen an emphasis on workers in the manufacturing space in a very long time. So I'll end with this. If we think about leading a digital transformation, it's leading change. And that becomes a really critical piece of it. The vision becomes important, transparency and communications, and that growing and acquiring talent, collaborating across the organization, and engaging workers in remote practices are going to be critical skills, several of which we have not emphasized within the manufacturing community. So that, there's my colleague and I, but I'll be happy to share these slides with whoever's interested.
I'm sorry, Faith, it's your colleague. Irene, Liz, Sue, thank you for very informative, passionate, and useful work. Obviously, the three of you have put a lot of thought, years and years of thought into this, years of research, but beyond that, a real caring for this topic. And it shows in the work you're doing. We appreciate that. We'd like to now open it up for questions. I certainly have a few. If we can have the panelists bring themselves back up into the magical world of video, that would be great. If not, that's all right. Liz, I mentioned in evolution, you talked about 40 years of technology change. I'll go back 25 plus years ago, being involved in an education program at General Motors, working at the Hamtramck plant, which at the time was the most, and Liz's was the most advanced technology plant in the United States. And I was doing an education program with lower level managers and production workers, and a fight broke out over the technology. It was literally a fight, and we had to get, but that kind of tension, that implementation, that implementing of new technologies and struggling with technologies and putting it in and pulling it back, Liz, is nothing new. This industry has been doing it forever, but with regard to some of the digital stuff for the last 20 or 30 years. How do we move forward effectively, given our history of struggling so much with it?
Oh, Brett. Well, again, people on this, everybody has some experience here, and I think probably some thoughts about this. My sense right now, and please weigh in, anyone else, is that actually there's a little bit more attention. We have, there's enough battle scars in a lot of these companies to recognize that what they did, how they approached this 20 years ago, or even 10 years ago, is not going to work. And so we have been really, I'd say, impressed with some of the ways in which firms are understanding. They've said to us, it's not the technology. They've said it's the social, cognitive, and organizational efforts around this. So, we need to think about, or they're saying we need to think about how we need to completely transform our organization as a whole. How, the interaction of workers between management and workers, with the whole flow of data, the way we're setting up, setting up factory floors, all of this is now on the table in a way that I think we perhaps were not as cognizant in the past of those, those non-technological, if you will, issues that Irene talked about as being so central. And, I think we can discuss whether Industry 4.0, how that whole movement has helped us think that way, or gotten people in the right frame of mind. But really, you keep hearing time and time again, it's a mindset, right? It's a mindset. And I think so. I think that I'm hopeful that actually current leadership understands. It doesn't mean I'm not sure it's easier, but the aiming part that Irene talked about is potentially more precise.
Yeah, so I want to, our interviews, our work has found a much more willing to accept and desire to accept is just that history. And Irene, we looked at this from the automotive side. You looked at it much, much broader. How does automotive stack up against others? Is it advanced? Is it beyond? Is it harder? Is it easier?
Well, it depends whether you're talking automotive OEMs or tier 1s versus some of the smaller companies that support them. There are definitely some differences. We didn't find any significant differences in terms of size, and we didn't find any significant differences in terms of industry sector. So we can present them in total because the size and sector wasn't a descriptive factor. With that said, I think it's pretty clear that many of the automotive companies are far ahead. They've spent a lot more time digitizing. They've spent a lot more time working on digital designs and simulations and things that support some of the back end of all this production. And they have more experience with the fixed conveyor belt kind of production, mass production. Unfortunately, some of these companies are much more rigid than they want to be. So when they think about how do I become agile, some of the companies have had very deep experience with computers and with automation are sort of locked in some ways, and they're really struggling with that.
Sorry about that. Sue, you like I had been involved in that old Pell program, what seems like now 100 years ago, and for this industry, it's as good as 100 years ago. What's your perspective on how this industry has changed with regard to implementing technology in the manufacturing process, on the work floor? Sue, I think you need to, yep.
Sorry about that. It's a really interesting question, and I wanted to, I thought the way Irene put it about you need to go slow to go fast. I think that there is a increasing recognition of the value of that, and of the IT folks not just coming in and imposing, but looking for pain points. I think perhaps an area is that could be good for future progress is what often seems to happen in our research is that technologists do go in and look for pain points, and that's good, but then they go off, design the solution, and come back with a solution. There's not a lot of co-developing of a solution, which is where real power is, and it may take longer to develop the solution, but implementation is much faster. And I think that a lot of the investment, that this paid employment leave program was a joint program between some of the American automakers and the UAW, and there's been these kind of long, painful, bureaucratic, conflict-ridden, but persistent efforts at continuous improvement, and you can see, particularly in some plants that have stayed the course, that they've been really able, and I guess I'll call out the Cleveland engine plant at Ford, as really working through some stuff and making some progress there.
So Sue, many years ago, I was giving a presentation at the Cleveland engine plant, and it went very difficult in the morning. I sat down with the plant manager at lunchtime and said, "Boy, that was tough." He said, "Yeah, I brought you in because this is our hardest group it was the pattern makers, our hardest group to fix. And I wanted you to take the heat. So when I came in the afternoon, it'd be a lot easier." So you mentioned one that's near and dear to my heart, friend.
And they've transformed in the last 10 years. So yeah.
It's all because of my morning presentation, I'm sure. No. It was brutal. I still remember it well. As we went through our project, and before we wrap up today, I'll talk a little more about our project. But a lot of the companies we spoke with almost apologized for being what they thought was behind the curve, just implementing Industry X, just starting down this pathway. It is very much a journey. It's very much different companies are at different places. How do you, when you look at a company, each of you, and you start to think about that company and you've talked to them, you've interviewed them, you've surveyed them, what are the points that you look at to say this company is on that journey, but understands that journey? And Liz, I'll start with you if you like. When you look.
I guess maybe one of the first things I would say is a humbleness about data. That we've met firms where literally large firms have said, in the last year they've hired 25 data scientists from all over to, go all in on the data and be able to say, we don't know what we're doing. We're not sure, where this is going. We haven't figured out what problems we're trying to solve. And there's a certain understanding of that, a humbleness about, the data part, which is it's the grease on all of this, right? It's exactly as you pointed out, it's the critical piece. The challenges of accessing, cleaning up, integrating, aggregating, all of that across, within the organization, let alone, across organizations or with suppliers, et cetera, is, I think, a first sign that people are really taking that seriously and understanding, what the challenges are there. So for me, when people have been able to say, we haven't mastered the data piece and we understand it's a long way to go, that is a sign that they're taking, looking at this, taking this seriously and, going slow to go fast down the road. I think that one's important. The other one I'd say that I think is also a sign of enlightenment about where we're going, what your organization, what you want it to look like, and how we talk about kind of continuous learning is, as Sue said, is sort of bringing in workers early on to help solve the pain points, is to actually have that kind of co-discussion, co-evolution, which requires an amount of trust. And again, firms who are able to do that, in my mind, are the ones that have understood that, there's a whole new way in which we're going to get higher productivity, et cetera, is kind of a culture of learning, a culture of trust, a culture where, everyone's expertise is kind of brought in early on to kind of solve problems together.
So real quick, I'm in my office for the third time since March 13th, but on my board, Liz, I have Liz, I have Irene. Data is king, but nobody we spoke with really understands it. So Liz, to your point, people are admitting, we know it's king, but what do we do with it? Irene, your thoughts on what shows a true understanding?
I think I like Liz's comment about being humble. I'll take a little different perspective on it and say that we found more resistance among middle managers than we did around line workers or senior workers. And so I think there's a real mindset shift that's got to happen I did a seminar with a group of executives, and they were quite hesitant to think about data-driven decision-making, because they said, if I do data-driven decision-making, people will know right away if I made the wrong decision. And so I think that we tend to think about the adoption problem as being the line workers don't really want this. I'm seeing a lot of middle management. So when you think about what can accelerate some of this, I think it's a cultural shift that has to have people coming together in tribes as opposed to formal organizations. And these tribes are people who are like-minded and support each other. And they actually grow over time and provide some of the glue across these smart projects. But that's what I think is a chasm that we're going to have to deal with.
Sue, do you want to wrap that one up?
Yeah, maybe I'd say two things. So one would be balance. You want the decentralization, and I've really talked about that. But you also need some centralization around data structures and things like that. How do you get that balance right is really key. And then I think also this balance between experimentation and repeatable processes. There's also, it's an old tension, but it still exists. And you're getting that right and thinking about, if you don't have a culture of experimentation, why not? Is it, an exhortation probably isn't enough. You may need to think about some of the hidden incentives that you've got in your company and think about those things. So people who are thinking about these balances and thinking about what they're actually encouraging people to do versus what they want them to do, those two things I would point to.
Irene, I want to come back to data just for a moment. We're running a little bit out of time here, but data is king. I've heard data is king. Data is more valuable than the product, or as valuable as the product, but people don't understand it. What do they need to understand about data, or what is it that you see companies doing well with the data? You talked about bringing in data scientists. Not all companies can afford to do that.
No, in fact, most companies can't. Let's be real honest about it. Unless you're a top tier OEM, you really can't afford data scientists, and that competition is just going to get more intense. So data is king, but it's understanding what data matters. There's a lot of data out there, but not all of it is critical and matters. So understanding which data matters in the physical world, and then understanding, and this comes back to trust, which somebody mentioned earlier, understanding how the heuristics of these algorithms actually process that data, so that when I get an output from an AI technology, for example, I trust it. And we've done a very poor job, technology companies included, have done a very poor job really describing how these algorithms process that data and what they do with it and what assumptions they make. And so I think that the technology companies, my own included, need to spend more time talking not just about the data, but how the data gets used and what intrinsic biases are included, and also how the data gets processed, so that when the output is spit out, it's not from a magical box, it's something that I understood.
Very good. I'm going to read a question here and then we'll wrap it up. In automotive, the underlying technologies are also changing. New materials, new production technologies, new powertrain technologies from my world. Does that facilitate bringing different organizational and data using approaches into the workplace? Anyone want to think about that and respond? Is the
I mean, I think it can. It may seem like a whole lot to bite off, but it could be, you're going to have to make some changes anyway. This is a time for a clean slate. This is a time to put in some metrics around experimentation. So yeah, go for it all at once.
Yeah, we hear so much, and I heard the word legacy a few times: legacy workforce, legacy technology, legacy production technology, legacy technologies. If you're replacing an older technology, you're probably not going to put in a legacy system. You're going to put in a new system. It's an opportunity. I think actually it is 11 o'clock, so we're at our cut point with just a moment or two left. Any closing thoughts, Liz, on where you go from here with your work?
Well, it's interesting. I think that from from our point of view, we have described, we see where we are as from a technology and labor market point of view. We've sort of put a stake in the ground to say, here's where we think the challenges are. Now, as this conversation has emphasized, it's about the how. How are we going to do this? How are we going to empower people? How are we going to use technology to augment all of our capabilities? And from my point of view, there's a lot of momentum. There's a lot of enthusiasm also, I will say, for manufacturing in this country going forward. I think we've got a bright horizon going forward. So I'm quite excited about what the next chapter holds.
Irene, how about yourself? Where do you go from here?
Well, we're going to continue to study the way that technology investments are changing. We're seeing already a change from 2019, which we thought we knew was going on post-COVID. We're going to see what happens. So we're just going to continue to follow that. But it's for me, it's all about the holistic piece of it. It's not just you can't just push one button and think it's going to solve everything.
And Sue, finally.
As you said, Industry X is a journey, not a destination, and I think we'd be very interested to continue the conversation.
That I think is a great academic viewpoint of anything. More research is needed, I think. Isn't that pretty much the academic way of doing things?
We actually would hope to do it in collaboration, actually implement some of the things we've talked about.
Yeah, very good. So first, before I wrap it up, all three of you, wonderful job. It was a lot of fun from my point, because this is a topic, the people part of the workforce is just a topic that I spent a lot of time with for 20 years, and it's just so important to this business. People tend, when they're doing anything, to forget that it's people that make it happen. And you three have done some fabulous work over the last several years and decades on it, and really enjoyed what you did today. So for all the participants, thanks so much for great stuff. Again, Sue, to your point, we'll continue the collaboration. And for us at CAR, I wanted to take a step back and talk about the collaboration with the group on the Industry X project, with the companies I showed up there at the beginning. You can find out more about this project at our project our website. We will have 2 more webcasts, 2 more webinars, one on process and one on technology and strategy. And we will then have a report coming out over the next couple of weeks, maybe by mid-December, and hope after the new year to keep pushing down this pathway. So all three of you, thank you so much to all that stayed with us. Really appreciate it, and be well.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah.